We are in a study of early biblical history, and we're taking just kind of a survey approach. We're not necessarily talking a lot about details as it relates to the events and circumstances, but trying to get an overall picture of how the history of man unfolded and how God used different individuals throughout that plan, ultimately to bring about Jesus, ultimately to fulfill the purpose and plan of bringing salvation to mankind and uniting all people under the body of Christ. But we've been back into the Genesis account. We're actually, believe it or not, in those 6 lessons, we covered all of Genesis, and in terms of its highlights, if you will, and we're moving on into the book of Exodus today. Now, I will admit, Wednesday when I went home, I was thinking a little bit about our class Wednesday night, and I thought, wow, you covered all of Joseph in one class. That wasn't fair. And so I'm going to slow down a little bit in our approach. I'm going to try to cover half a lesson, and we'll get it done then on Sunday and Wednesday combined. We'll be able to do a lesson that way. I'm going to slow down just a little bit because I felt like I was just running a race and didn't give you guys much of a chance to chime in or say anything. So I'm going to slow down a little bit. And we're still going to do it survey, but I'm going to slow down, and we'll cover about half a lesson per class, and that way each week we'll get one lesson in instead of trying to race through an entire lesson. Particularly on Sundays, that's even more challenging because the time is less. So that's kind of going to be the approach from here on out as we move through. And so we're in lesson 7. If you have those, we set those out last week for you. So lesson 7, as we continue this study, and we're talking about, and I'll show it to you on the screen as well, but we're talking now about these early historical figures. And so let's just generically talk about the history that we've said so far. So you start with who? Adam and Eve, and then you have Cain and Abel. And why was it significant that we talked about Cain and Abel? Yeah, so you've got this first, not the first sin, that's Adam and Eve, right, as they partake of that fruit that they have been told not to. But you've got this one generation, and you're already committing pretty heinous acts towards one another. And so we talked about how that really ushers in tremendous challenges and difficulties. You fast forward into about chapter 6, and you get to who? Noah, right? Man's imaginations were completely sinful by the time you get to Noah. God decides He's going to cleanse the earth, start all over with Noah and his family, and that happens through the flood. After Noah, there's a scene where man tries to elevate himself again. Where was that? Tower of Babel, right? And so the Tower of Babel comes onto the picture. Man tries to elevate himself, build this tower to God, supposedly. God does what? Okay, confuses their languages and makes them scatter based on those languages and kind of humbles man in that sense after that. Who's after that? Who gets, okay, so Abraham gets the promises, right? So we're just trying to keep this chronological line going. So Abraham receives the promises first in chapter 12, then you see it again in 15, you see it again in 17. You kind of see God add a little here, reiterate those promises to Abraham. But Abraham was promised a son, a seed, that all these great things were going to accomplish through, but he didn't have one for a while. Ultimately, he has Isaac, right? He ultimately has Isaac, and then Isaac has Jacob and Esau, and we talked about the history of those two individuals as we walked through that. So Isaac has Jacob, and then Jacob has 12 sons, and in particular, Joseph. Joseph comes into prominence where? Not in Canaan, but over in Egypt. He gets sold out by his brothers into slavery, ends up in Egypt, has a whole pile of history around him, but ends up gaining prominence. And we talked Wednesday night about the fact, so prominent that what was the only thing that Pharaoh had over Joseph in relationship to Egypt? Yeah, the throne, right? The text says only difference between Pharaoh and Joseph was who was sitting on the throne. When it came to power, ability to rule, make decisions and choices for Egypt, Joseph was right there alongside Pharaoh. The only thing he didn't have was the throne. He had interpreted those dreams. Famine came just as God had said would in those dreams. But Egypt's ready because they were prepared. What do people do? Okay, so they prepare. Others come to Egypt for help, right? They come to Egypt for help. including whom? Joseph's brothers, right? Joseph's brothers show up, all but one. Benjamin, the youngest, wasn't with him, and his father wasn't. And so ultimately, all of those folks will end up in Egypt. Pharaoh will bless them with just the swamp land over here somewhere. Is there any swamps in Egypt, by the way? I'm not so sure that would work anyway. But fertile ground, right? Pharaoh offers to Joseph and his family Goshen, but not just a piece of wasteland that they wouldn't be able to do anything with, a land that would allow them to prosper and gain benefit. And who's blessing them all the way? God is. Every step of the way. So they grow in prosperity, and they grow in what? Numbers. A new Pharaoh comes on the throne. He doesn't know whom. He doesn't know the history of Joseph. Okay, so because he doesn't know the history of Joseph, in his mind, what's he got down there in the land of Goshen? A threat. Right. Yeah. He doesn't have down in the land of Goshen the family of the great leader Joseph. He's got a threat because they're growing in prosperity and numerically greater than Egypt. And the next thing you know, if we're not careful, they're going to be what? They're going to be in charge, right? They're going to be the ones taking over Egypt. And so he chooses to do what with them? Right. Well, he's going to enslave them eventually, and he decides to try to limit how their growth is happening. And he tells what group of individuals that they're going to have to take care of this. Midwives, right? They told what they do. Yeah, they were supposed to, but they said nothing doing. We're not doing that. That's where that narrative we talked about at the end of lesson 6, where he said you ought to obey God rather than men. And so they did that in relationship to that. And so they continued to grow, and they continued to grow. Ultimately, who's born? And that's where we are this morning in this lesson. Moses now is the next prominent figure on the scene of God's plan and God's history. And so here comes Moses. How does he get spared? Okay, so his mother sends his sister down, puts him in the basket, right, down the river, and along with the reeds. Pharaoh's daughter's down there. She sees him, takes him home. He ultimately becomes who? Basically. Yeah, her son, which makes him, grandson of Pharaoh. Not a bad gig, right? If you're in Egypt, not a bad way to be in terms of living. You wouldn't live much better than that, than to be part of the household of Pharaoh, even though you're not an Egyptian, but they're embracing him as such as God makes preparation throughout all of these things. All right, so pick up now Exodus chapter 2. We've reminded ourselves of all that history. Let's start in Exodus chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. And let's just kind of remind ourselves of this piece of history. So there went a man of the house of Levi and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could not longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. And his sister stood afar off to wit that would be done to him, that's a mouth, to watch what was going on. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the riverside. When she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child. Behold, the babe was doing what? Doing what babies do, right? Especially ones that have been put in a basket in the middle of the, right? So he's weeping, he's crying. And because of that, she had, isn't that interesting? What do you do if you've got a crying baby around? What do you want to do? Yeah, you want to comfort her, right? You go, grandparents especially have a hard time with that. Parents trying to get the child to learn how to cry it out. But the grandparent, whatever. You understand what I'm saying. You want to go and pick that child up and comfort it. And so that's exactly what she did. But she notices what? He's what? He's one of the He's one of Hebrews' children. So what I want you to, here's what I think is significant about that. Pharaoh's daughter understood that what she's about to do is to bring a Hebrew child into Pharaoh's household. In other words, this wasn't secret in that sense. It was understood who he was before they ever made the decision. She ever made the decision to bring him home. So then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?" Give her some credit for how wise she is. Now, again, I understand the providence of God is at work here, and God's plan and purposes are unfolding, but she's pretty smart. Can I go get a nurse for you from one of the Hebrew women, and she can help you out taking care of the child? Well, what's that sound? Sounds pretty, it sounds pretty reasonable, right? Because I'm Pharaoh's daughter. I'm not necessarily looking to be a full-time caretaker of this child. I have compassion for him, but I'm going to need some help. And so, yeah, go. And the maid went and called the child's mother. So his sister's able to pick who it is that's going to care for him in Pharaoh's house. So he goes and gets his mom. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, "Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages." And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, "Because I drew him out of the water." And so that sets the stage for how Moses is going to be able to be used in the purposes and plans of God, ultimately to bring the Israelites out of Egyptian bondage back to where? Back to Canaan. It's going to be a long time coming, right? We've been about not quite 400 years yet, right? Because we're going to get to the end before we can get to the full, and he's going to have to grow up here, be about 80 years old before he leads them out of Egypt. But it's a long time. Several centuries are going to go by with them down in Egypt. And what I want us to appreciate about that is, how quickly do we want God to do what we'd like Him to do? Right now, right? We think that God ought to act on everything that we think about in the immediate. God doesn't always act in the immediate. He let a long time go by with His people down in Egypt. He allows for a great bondage and enslavement to occur to them, and then hears the cries and brings them back. And the truth is, so long as they were prosperous in the land of Goshen and being left alone to just kind of grow as a people, what incentive would they have had? They wouldn't have had much incentive. It would have only had to have been just basically somebody stepping forth and saying, "Listen, we are the people of God. This isn't our permanent home. Canaan's where we're supposed to be," and step up and lead them back. But you're pretty comfortable, right? You're pretty comfortable there. And so when things become uncomfortable, the cries go out before God. Moses comes back on the scene and will ultimately lead them out of that situation. And it becomes pretty rough. Jump down to verse 23 of chapter 2. "And it came to pass in process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage. And they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob." Now, that's interesting language right there, especially in the King James. When he says He remembered His... Do you think He forgot it? It's not within the ability of God in that sense to just have, "Oh, I forgot." So what do you think He means by He remembered? Yeah, it's time. It's time now to begin to reinforce or reestablish the process and the plan and purposes that I had promised unto Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're many generations since then, but it's time. Yeah. And by the time you're all said and done in relationship to these things. And so God's going to fulfill this. But in that process of time, what happens with Moses? Okay, so he rises up into prominence. He's here in the household of Pharaoh, But he's got a situation that comes up ultimately that is going to create some difficulty. He stands up for whom? Yeah, one of his own, right? One of his own in terms of Hebrew brethren. And he's even willing to go as far as slay that Egyptian, right? Well, now you're in a dilemma. You may be the grandson of Pharaoh, but you're still a Hebrew adopted grandson of Pharaoh. And ultimately, what happens with Moses? Okay, so he ends up into the land of Midian. He's about 40 years old when this happens. So it, here's a side point lesson I think maybe we can appreciate about that. So for 40 years, how did Moses live? Yeah, pretty well, right? It's interesting that it was at 40 years old that he has an active conscience as it relates, right? Remember, this same Pharaoh that Moses has been living under that Pharaoh's roof and benefiting from all that there was to benefit from by living as the grandson of Pharaoh. What's happening with the people that same 40 years? Yeah, it's just getting worse and worse and worse for them. And here's the point I'm driving. Now, I'm not faulting Moses here. That's not what I'm trying to say. That it took him 40 years to finally have an active conscience. What I'm saying, though, is sometimes it takes people longer than maybe you or I think it should for it to finally click. For Moses, it was 40 years till finally clicked. I need to do something about this. I need to begin to defend and to consider the fact that I'm not an Egyptian. I am not just royalty because the daughter of Pharaoh happened to bring me home. I am first and foremost a Hebrew. And so he jumps in. And so don't ever lose heart or faith that somebody may finally get it. For some, it may take 40 years for it to click. That I need to do what's right. I need to do what's honorable. I need to step up here and do something about that. And that was kind of the lesson I thought you could.
It looked like God was kind of getting him ready for this leadership thing because there's 40 years with the Pharaoh.
Yeah.
And then he had 40 years out in the desolate place as a shepherd and stuff like that.
Right.
So it seemed like God was just preparing him
Yeah.
For this leadership role.
Yeah. And it's interesting because even though I think you're right, Ed, there's this preparation time that will ultimately provide for Moses the ability to go back and fulfill all these things. But what's interesting about that, the only guy that doesn't realize he's ready is Moses. So God's going to have to come and that's what we're going to look at here in chapter 3. You have to have a conversation with him. You're going to have to come talk to him. Good, Jim.
So we can figure his mother kept him informed of.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, I would agree with that. So, 40 years in the household of Pharaoh, has to get out because of slaying that Egyptian, lives in Midian, basically as a shepherd, under his father-in-law. What was his name? Jethro, and his wife's name was Zipporah, right? And so you've got Zipporah that Moses marries here in Midian, and he's working with his father-in-law Jethro. I simply introduce them to you because I don't know how much time we'll have to spend about them, but that later in the history there's kind of some difficulties, to say the least. And I think that what I appreciate about that is when you see that kind of history unfold with the problems with Zipporah and the father-in-law and the circumstances surrounding Moses, though Moses is this great leader ultimately and has these great purposes and plans that God uses him for, he's as flawed as Abraham. He's as flawed as Isaac. He's as flawed, he's got that human side to him that has flaws and difficulties, even though he's being used for great purposes of God. So, God appears to Moses there in the land of Midian through what form? The burning bush, right? And we often think about that. And Moses sees this bush on fire, but it's not what? Not being consumed. Okay, generally speaking, that's not something you'd see ever, let alone here in the circumstance of Moses. So he approaches, he wants to see what's going on. What's the first thing God tells him? Okay, you kick off your shoes because you're, for the place whereon, there in verse 5, where thou standest is holy ground. What made it holy? Presence of God. I think that's significant for us, a principle to appreciate. From Moses forward, and backward for that matter as well, where there were certain restrictions about the tabernacle, because it had a very, very divine purpose. There were restrictions and rules and laws that governed the temple, but primarily because of why? The presence of God was there. And so those rules and regulations and things that they had to honor as it relates to the location of the tabernacle or the location of the temple or the location of this burning bush has more to do not with the place. It has more to do with who was there. When you come into the presence of God, you're on holy ground. There's the reverence and a respect that God always deserves when you come into His presence. And to demonstrate that, very specifically for Moses, was take your shoes off. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses did what? He hid his face and was afraid to look. And I would like to believe, so would I. Right? So would we. I mean, number one, so your curiosity, right? The first thing that brought you there was curiosity. You look off in the distance, here's this burning bush. And so from off in the distance, you see it. It's not being consumed. So your curiosity says, I got to go take a look at that. You get closer. You hear the voice. Kick your shoes off. You're standing on holy ground. And out of sheer fear, you hide your face from the conversation. The Lord says to him, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters. For I know their sorrows. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land unto a good land, and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I have also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppress them. Here's what I want us to notice about this. Does God say, do you see the word if anywhere in this narrative? No. God is saying this is the reality. I have heard their voice and their cries. I am going to do something about it. I am going to bring them in back to Canaan, into the land. There's no, well, Moses, if we could figure out a plan. Moses, you got any ideas about how we could? It's asked and answered. God makes statements like this to the people of Israel throughout the history of Moses' connection to them. And they don't always catch it. Moses, I'm not looking for you to fulfill these purposes on your own. I intend to fulfill them. You just happen to be the one I'm going to use in order to fulfill and accomplish those purposes. God considered Israel, that prized body of people, that He intended from the days of Abraham to fulfill His purposes. And it's been long enough that they haven't been in that promised land and living and acting in accordance, if you will, with God's plans and purposes for them. Because the truth is, and we learned this later in history, but while they're in Egypt, they basically become what? Well, but they become Egyptians. And it's never seen any more clearly then when Moses is gone too long, when he goes up on Sinai, and Aaron and them decide we need a new God because the God of Moses, it wasn't their God yet in their minds, apparently. And so we're going to build us a God just like the Egyptians had before. God says, enough of that. It's time to bring them out of Egypt and get them back to being the people I had intended for them to be from the beginning. Look at the record in Acts chapter 7 real quick, and that'll lead us into that series of questions that's in your lesson sheets. But Acts chapter 7, in recounting some of this, says, and when he was full 40 years old, it came into his heart, there's that conscience we talked about, to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him, and avenged him that was oppressed, and smote the Egyptian. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. That's significant, by the way. So when Moses goes, act of conscience, heart tells him it's time to go visit my brethren and see what I can do with them. If I'm understanding that reading right, in Luke's account here in Acts, when Moses goes and does that at 40 years old, he thinks he's going to do what ultimately? Yeah. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. Now, I realize we're talking about backwards looking, right? History's hard sometimes when you're looking backwards because you have to figure out in what chronology are we talking about here. But my understanding is when he's 40, he's ready to get him out of there and feels that God will allow him and has brought him into this situation and purpose to do that. Now, here's why I believe that's important for us to consider for a minute. If that be true, now you understand the reluctance at 80 years old to want to go back. I thought they would get it 40 years ago, God. I thought they would understand that was what I was going to do for them 40 years ago. Now you're telling me at 80 years old to go back and fulfill that. They didn't want it the first time. What makes you think they want it the second time? So don't just think Moses is trying to get out of it when God speaks to him at the burning bush. Moses has a history. I already tried that once, and it didn't go so well. I thought I was there to help them. They got mad at me because they thought now the Egyptians were going to make their labor even harder because of what I had done. They don't want me. And then those questions come about who sent me. What am I going to tell him? How am I going to convince him? Because he didn't have that great experience when the first. So go back to those questions then. I can bring it up on the screen for you here. So according to Acts 7, 23 through 25, how did Moses assume the Israelites would view him? Yeah, as a leader, someone who could guide them back out of this bondage and out of these issues. He thought for sure they would understand him to be able to fulfill that purposes. True or false? Moses did not have faith in God until he saw the burning bush. And Acts chapter 7 kind of clearly illustrates that as well. That's false. Now, he may not have fully understood what God intended, and he may not have had may have had some reservations when God says it's time for you to go back and lead the people, but he's not faithless. In fact, at 40 years old, he thought, I just assumed my brethren would understand that God was providing this for me to come and do this. I'd have to go back and look too. But I think that I think it's accurate that that's the man we're dealing with.
Is Moses kind of questioning God on this?
Well, and I don't.
Because they did do it the first time.
Yeah, I don't think he's. I don't want to over speculate on what I think Moses is thinking, but I think Moses' greater concern is I'm not the guy. I don't know that his is God. You can't do this. I think this is God. I can't do this, and that's why the questions, concerns, and the conversations occur as it relates to them. So ultimately, though, he's going to go back, and he's going to begin to fulfill God's purposes, which aren't going to be easy to accomplish. How would a snake, leprosy, blood, and Aaron, help Moses fulfill this purpose? Go ahead, Gary, you're fine. Yeah. And so it evidences the power of God. When Aaron fulfills his role, you're able to turn a rod into a snake. You're able to bring kinds of plagues that are serious and devastating and real. I think sometimes that needs to be understood, even in our culture and world, that what God fulfilled through men like Moses and Aaron and the apostles, those were real acts. Not some of the things we hear in modern times where we're going to cure things that we can't actually evidence. And so this is real. They saw the power of God being evidenced before the Egyptians' eyes as each plague came one by one. Any other thoughts about that first section now that we've got Moses heading back to Egypt to start bringing the people out? Okay, jump to chapter 5 then. Let's look at chapter 5, verse 22, because we need to remind ourselves that all of this is through the purpose and plan of God, and a reassuring of them of the promises that God had made. Notice the language. So Moses returned unto the Lord and said, Lord, wherefore hast thou so evil entreated this people? Why is it that thou hast sent me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in thy name, he hath done evil to this people, neither hast thou delivered thy people at all. And so, again, we're not going to talk about all the plagues one by one and all those details, but I just want you to think about them as a body of things that God was doing. Up until the death of the firstborn, how many plagues do we go through? 9, right? So there's 10 till you get to the death of the firstborn. It takes 10. It takes 10 to finally convince Pharaoh to let him go. So along the way, Moses is saying to himself, every time a new one comes on the scene, he's convinced what? This ought to be the one that gets him. Surely this one will get it. He kind of thought he had him win. Remember when they were putting their boots on and they were opening up their ovens? Yeah, the frogs, right? And the frogs, and Moses goes to have a conversation with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's kind of fed up, and he's trying to make a deal with how far he can go and worship his God, and Moses says, you just say the word when you want the frogs to go on, and we can make it happen. And Pharaoh kind of says, well, how about tomorrow? And so you see glimpses of Pharaoh trying to make compromises. Pharaoh's trying anything but letting all of that nation that were doing what, by the way, for Pharaoh? Building his cities and his fortified places. And, he's using slave labor to build his cities. And he sees letting them go as a challenge to that. So one by one, Moses is getting a little bit frustrated because every time a plague hits, all Pharaoh does is get more harsh, angry, and he hasn't changed. So then the Lord said unto Moses, verse 1 of chapter 6, Now shalt thou see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand shall he let them go, and with a strong hand shall he drive them out of his land. And God spoke unto Moses and said unto him, I am the Lord, and I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, by the name of God Almighty, by my name Jehovah, was I not known to them. So you see that kind of introduction, by the way, of when God, Yahweh, Jehovah, is kind of begin to be known by the people, not fully understood in terms of identification, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I have also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage, wherein they were strangers. And I have also heard the groaning of the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians keep in bondage. And I have remembered my covenant. Wherefore say unto the children of Israel, I am the Lord. Remember what he told Moses Moses says, what am I supposed to tell the people when they ask me who sent me? And Moses was told, what? You tell them the I am has sent you. And you see that repeatedly come back up in this narrative. The I am the Lord. And I will rid you out of their bondage. I will redeem you with a stretched out arm and with great judgments. I will take you to me for a people. I will be to you a God. And you shall know that I am the Lord your God, which bringeth you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And I will bring you into the land concerning the which I did swear to give it to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you for an heritage. I am the Lord. And Moses spoke so unto the children of Israel, but they hearkened not unto Moses for anguish of spirit and for cruel bondage. So not only does Moses feel some discouragement that the plagues up till this point haven't done anything but make Pharaoh mad and their work and bondage harder, but who else feels that way? Yeah, the people themselves. Though God keeps reiterating, I've made a promise. This promise is deeper than just to you. These promises were grounded and executed with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. The covenant that I have made is deeper than just you. I will fulfill it. But because of the tremendous amount of heavier burden and more work and more difficult work that Pharaoh kept placing upon the people, they're not convinced. They're not convinced. And they're discouraged for the anguish of spirit that they had for all the cruel bondage that they were receiving. And so even though they continue to have these conversations and compromises are attempted to be made by Pharaoh, and God's plan and purpose is to ultimately bring them completely out and back to the promised land, not just walk away for a little ways and then come back later. Pharaoh even at times would say, well, you can take the men and go worship, but what? Leave whom? Yeah, leave your families back here. Well, who's going to go off and then try to sneak away after that, right? You're going to, even if you went to worship, you'd come back because your families that were all gathered there. Real quickly, before we run out of time this morning, look at chapter 7. So the Lord said unto Moses, see, I have made thee a God to Pharaoh, and Aaron thy brother shall be thy prophet. Thou shalt speak all that I command thee, and Aaron thy brother shall speak unto Pharaoh, that he send the children of Israel out of his land. I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. By the way, real quick, chronologically, I think that's a hard statement, right? Because that implies that God is responsible for taking away Pharaoh's free will and choice in this matter. But I believe what we need to appreciate from this sentiment is simply he's talking about the result after the fact, writing history after the fact. And so God's telling Moses, listen, here's what I'm going to do. And you would think it would soften Pharaoh's heart for him to say, get out of here. But it's not going to. What I'm actually going to do will actually have the opposite effect initially and will harden his heart. And Pharaoh's not going to listen to you in verse 4. That I may lay my hand upon Egypt and bring forth mine armies and my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great judgment. But just food for thought real quick as we finish here. 30 seconds. Think about this for a minute. Moses shows up, says, hey, Pharaoh, God wants his people back. Pharaoh says, no problem, Moses. Tell them all to pack up. I'll even provide for you the ability to travel. Head on back into the Canaan land. All is well. Who gets credit? And Pharaoh. And Pharaoh gets credit. God says, I'm going to bring him to his knees. And he will know when they leave, it was by the power of God that they left. Not any free will choice that Pharaoh makes. I'm going to harden his heart. Out of a hardened heart, he's going to turn his people loose. Just think about that as we go into our study on Wednesday. That God wanted to make sure that Pharaoh knew it was him. It was God, not Pharaoh, that was going to let them have this freedom and get them out of that bondage.